The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Irene Varley, Director of Education for the Dibble Institute. Today's relevant topic is changing attitudes, the impact of relationship education on predictors of dating violence, presented by Dr. Rachel Savasut-Luxton. Joining me from Dibble on this webinar is Aaron Larson, today's wizard behind the curtain, who engineers the technical sides of things. You might have some dealings with him because he is also our director of programs. Thank you so much, Aaron, for being with us today.
Yeah, so
And if
actually, Irene, so speaking of the quick wizard thing, so for those of you who can't see the screen yet, I'm currently working on that. So by the time Rachel actually talks, we should have that fixed. But
okay,
go ahead.
all right, okay. Well, thank you, Aaron. And if I can add that our usual wizard is Kathy Guidry, Customer Service and Training Manager, who lives in Wilmington, North Carolina. So our thoughts and prayers are with her and others facing Hurricane Florence this week. Some housekeeping comments for you. If you have audio difficulties, you can stay on the internet and phone in to hear the broadcast. The call-in number is listed on the webinar message you received with the link to join us. All attendees are muted. And we anticipate that you will have questions or comments for Rachel as she progresses through her research. As questions come to mind, please jot them down during the presentation, and we will have a Q&A following the presentation in which you can directly submit your questions in the question box located on your control panel. If you're, please familiarize yourself with that. It is questions right there in the gray area on your control panel under webcam. If we should run out of time and your question isn't answered, we will be sure to address it directly to you after the webinar. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and if you wish to listen again or to send on to a colleague, you can find the recording on our homepage, www.dibbleinstitute.org, and other archived webinar recordings that we save there. In reviewing this registration for today, I am seeing that many new people are attending who may not be familiar with the Dibble Institute. So I'd like just to take a few brief moments to introduce you to our institute. Charlie Dibble, the founder, was an aeronautical engineer who carried his problem-solving skills back home to his home community in his retirement years. He dedicated his time to working with youth on a volunteer basis. This is Charlie and his wife, Helen. Unfortunately, Charlie died back in the early 90s, and so he left his legacy with us. During this time in the late 80s and early 90s, he witnessed the impact of the rising divorce rate and the impact it was having on the youth he served. His question then was, what are we doing to help youth thrive in spite of their negative family experiences? He sought any research that may have been available at that time on attitudes regarding a young person's love and marriage or long-term relationships. Well, we found nothing was being conducted at that time. Most of it was on married couples. Charlie founded that what was known as the Dibble Fund, which has evolved to present day, the Dibble Institute, which is a secular national 501c3 nonprofit organization. He insisted that any solutions that were aimed at youth must be backed by valid research. And so everything that we do today has to be backed by research. Our institute is, our mission is to equip young people with the skills and knowledge they need to develop healthy romantic relationships now and for their futures. Our mantra, you might say, is a teen's love life is not neutral to their future success. As a mission-driven institution, we translate research into learning tools for youth and young adults. I encourage you to visit our website to view all the research-based materials we publish to help you and your organizational partners serve youth and young adults. We also offer master trainings and professional development opportunities related to the development of youth and young adult protective factors. In offering these free Second Wednesday webinars, we aim to carry on Charlie's mission. So now let me introduce you to our special presenter today. Dr. Rachel Savasuk-Luxton is a research specialist and master trainer with the Dibble Institute. She is a very recent addition to our staff. She received her doctorate in human development and family studies from Auburn University, where she both implemented and evaluated youth-focused relationship education programs, and most specifically, Relationship Smarts Plus, one of our very special programs. With that, Dr. Savasuk-Luxton, Rachel, welcome, and thank you for all the valuable research you're willing to share with our audience this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Irene, for that introduction, and to all of you so much for joining me today for the Dibble Institute's September 2nd Wednesday webinar, which is a mouthful. Try and say that 3 times fast. In today's presentation, I'm going to be providing some background information on predictors of adolescent dating violence, specifically adolescents' dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs, and the results of a study I conducted which considered the impact of relationship education on both dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs. I'll also be discussing how in the sample adolescents' gender, race, and socioeconomic status, both individually and in combination, impacted change in these outcomes. Then we'll conclude by discussing the limitations of the study and the potential implications for programming based on the results. I'd like to note that for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be focusing solely on the significant findings of the study. However, the full article is available for you to review if you'd like any further information. But before we get started, I have a quick poll question for you. I'd like to know what you all think about the prevalence of adolescent dating violence. So what do you think? What percentage of adolescents report experiencing dating violence in their romantic relationships? So we can just a second, and there will be a poll for you. There we go. Okay, so we've got a pretty wide range here, and it's actually pretty tricky. So in a 2015 study, it was reported that approximately 20% of females and 10% of males reported experiencing physical or sexual violence or both by a romantic partner in the last 12 months. But in a more recent national study that used a more comprehensive measurement of adolescent dating violence, so it included psychological violence and had more items for each of these indicators of violence, it was reported that 69% of adolescents who were currently or recently in a romantic relationship reported experiencing dating violence in the last 12 months. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Erin. Oh. Sorry, yeah, there we go. So that's why we're discussing this today, because violence in the context of romantic relationships has been of great concern for both researchers and practitioners for many years, but the focus has primarily been on adult couples. And more recently, adolescent dating violence has garnered considerable attention as it has been deemed a significant public health concern. So like I said, this has led to a growing interest in understanding why dating violence occurs in the context of adolescent romantic relationships. And adolescence is a particularly important developmental period as involvement in romantic relationships becomes quite common. So in one study, it was reported that over 70% of adolescents reported having had a romantic relationship by the age of 18. And these early romantic experiences serve as the foundation for future relationship expectations, both good and bad. But due to the inexperience in romantic relationships and an lack of formal education on what constitutes or what makes up a healthy relationship, this population is believed to be especially vulnerable to these dating violence experiences. So considering the prevalence of adolescent dating violence, as well as the many short and long-term negative outcomes that are associated with these experiences, there's been an increased risk on focusing on identifying the risk and the protective factors for experiencing dating violence in adolescent relationships. Next slide, please. So to date, a number of risk factors for experiencing dating violence have been identified, including two key attitudes, and these are dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs. So these two attitudes were the focus of the current study because they're both considered to be robust predictors of dating violence victimization and perpetration. So the first we're going to discuss is dating violence acceptance. And this is often measured in the literature as the extent to which individuals believe that violent and aggressive behaviors are acceptable, particularly under certain circumstances, such as when they feel insulted or disrespected, or when they're hit or pushed first. And I've actually seen this when I've been out implementing programs of adolescents saying, well, they pushed me, so I'm allowed to push them back or be aggressive back. So the acceptance of the use of aggression or violence in romantic relationships has been consistently identified as a risk factor for dating violence experiences. Next slide. And like dating violence acceptance, traditional gender role beliefs have also been found to be associated with both dating violence perpetration and victimization. So these traditional gender roles operate as the script, or kind of the guidelines for what broader society deems as appropriate and acceptable behaviors and roles for men and women in a variety of domains. And according to feminist theory, traditional gender roles stem from the ideology that men are entitled to power, authority, and control over women in both the public and private spheres of life. And accordingly, women are expected to be submissive to men across these domains. And these power differentials are reinforced throughout the lifespan. And according to the gender intensification hypothesis, the societal pressure to adhere to these gender-related norms is particularly heightened during adolescence. Next slide. And these two attitudes, so dating violence acceptance and adherence to traditional gender role beliefs, are believed to be impacted by salient sociodemographic characteristics or identities, such as gender, race, and socioeconomic status. So gender has been identified as a stable predictor of traditional gender role beliefs and dating violence acceptance attitudes, with males often reporting more traditional gender role beliefs and greater acceptance of the use of aggression against a romantic partner than females. And I just wanted to note for everyone tuning in that the numbers at the end of some of these sentences refer to an article that I'm referencing, and that reference list is attached to the end of the PowerPoint. So if you want to look up any of these studies, you are more than welcome to after the presentation. But these gender differences in the adherence to traditional gender roles and the acceptance of the use of aggression in romantic relationships can be traced back to the theory of gender and power. And this theory emphasizes the sexual division of power between males and females, and it argues that this sexual division of power is reinforced at different societal levels that determine for whom it is acceptable to use forceful or aggressive behaviors. And this reinforcement begins early in childhood, when boys are expected to be and rewarded for aggressive behaviors, whereas girls tend to be expected to be sensitive and nurturing, and are taught more so the importance of interpersonal relationships. And this is continuously reinforced over the lifespan. And it sets the foundation for gender normative behaviors later on, particularly during adolescence, where, like I just mentioned, the pressure to adhere to these gender-related expectations is especially high. And researchers have also noted differences across both racial and ethnic groups. So more specifically, research has demonstrated that African American youth are more likely to endorse traditional gender role beliefs, particularly in regards to family life, and they're more likely to condone the use of violence than European American adolescents. And although there are a few studies that have examined the role of socioeconomic status, or SES, in individuals' gender role beliefs and dating violence attitudes, some studies suggest that parental education, which is often used as a proxy for socioeconomic status, is related to both of these. So more specifically, children whose parents are more highly educated, these children are less likely to hold traditional gender role beliefs, and vice versa. And evidence suggests that adolescents in lower SES adolescents tend to be more accepting of dating violence than higher SES adolescents. And this leads me to our next poll question. So with this information in mind, thinking about your youth that you work with, do you believe that it is important that we consider the combination of their gender, race, and socioeconomic status? So do you believe that the combination of their gender, race, and socioeconomic status influence both their experiences and their attitudes? Yes. Okay, so the majority of you answered yes. And yeah, recent research and theory suggests that we can't just assume that gender or these other sociodemographic characteristics alone count for the diversity of human experiences and societal advantages and disadvantages. However, researchers have yet to examine the intersection of these identities when testing adolescents' gender role beliefs and dating violence acceptance. So this leads me to the next slide, please. So this study was situated within the theoretical framework of intersectionality, which suggests that we should move beyond focusing on these singular demographic identities, especially just gender. And this is because it's the intersection of gender with other salient sociodemographic identities like race and socioeconomic status that informs one's life experiences, affects individuals' power, and creates differences in behavioral expectations and even diversity within gender groups. So for example, some evidence research finds that Black males tend to endorse more egalitarian beliefs than their white male counterparts, but this varies depending on the context. So specifically, Kane and colleagues suggested that Black men tend to be more egalitarian than white men regarding women's workforce participation, but tend to be more traditional in regards to gendered roles within the home and within romantic relationships. And Hill suggests that it's possible that due to experiences of racial discrimination and oppression in areas of life outside of the home, that may be why Black males may be more likely to assert their power and dominance in romantic relationships, and in turn hold more traditional gender role beliefs about couple relationships and family life. And though females are often less tolerant of relationship violence than males, research finds that Black females tend to report higher tolerance of relationship aggression than white females. But despite the theory of intersectionality's call for the attention to the combined effects of these different social constructs, the intersection of gender, race, and socioeconomic status is often and has been overlooked in the research. So because of the strong relationship between dating violence acceptance and gender role beliefs and dating violence experiences, understanding these differences by individuals' sociodemographic identities can both help to inform interventions aimed at preventing adolescent dating violence, and can also help us better understand for whom current programs are more or less beneficial. Which brings me to the next slide on relationship education. So from a developmental perspective, adolescence is the time in which romantic relationships are beginning to form, making this an ideal time to implement early intervention or prevention programs like relationship education, which target problematic relationship beliefs and expectations like dating violence acceptance. So relationship education programs focus on the importance of healthy relationships. They present information on unhealthy dating relationship patterns, and also provide tools and skills training for engaging in healthy relationship behaviors. And these healthy relationship skills-based prevention programs are typically offered to the general population and have demonstrated improvements in key target outcomes related to dyadic interactions. So this as things such as communication skills, conflict resolution skills, and interpersonal competence. And because unhealthy relationship patterns and dating violence are specifically addressed in relationship education curriculum, positive changes in dating violence acceptance after program participation is often expected. And as such, a handful of adolescent relationship education studies have documented significant improvements in dating violence acceptance after program participation, and thus provide the foundation for the current study. And although not an explicit target outcome of relationship education, there have been 2 exploratory studies, one with adult samples and one with adolescent samples, that have investigated the influence of relationship education on traditional gender role beliefs and found support for their malleability, so their ability to be shifted following program participation. Specifically, Whitaker and colleagues, using the adolescent sample, found gender differences. So they found improvements, that individuals became more egalitarian, so less traditional following programming, with an even steeper improvement, so greater improvement for males over females. Though altering traditional gender role beliefs is not a focus of relationship education, it's possible that some areas of the curriculum, such as those that focus on the principles of a healthy relationship and the importance of common values, may create this shift in adolescents' perceptions regarding roles and expectations in romantic relationship. Also, the emphasis on mutual respect throughout the lessons may influence role expectations, as well as the expected and actual treatment of partners in relationships. So there are a few studies, though, that have actually examined change in these outcomes, and no studies have examined variation in both dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs based on the interaction of participant sociodemographic identities, which leads me to the current study. Next slide. So the current study advances research on the influence that relationship education participation has on both adolescents' dating violence acceptance and gender role beliefs in at least 3 ways. So by including a comparison sample of adolescents who were not exposed to relationship education, we're able to understand patterns of change and violence-related attitudes for youth who participated in relationship education compared to those who did not. And second, this study is explicitly guided by the theory of gender and power and the intersectional framework to better understand how the interactions of gender, race, and socioeconomic status and how they relate to change and violence-related attitudes. And by doing this, we are better able to, like I said, understand for whom relationship education appears to be most beneficial. So we had specific hypotheses and research questions with this study. So we believed that adolescents who participated in relationship education would report less dating violence acceptance and would become more egalitarian or less traditional than adolescents who did not participate or receive any sort of relationship education. And then we also looked at the impact of, like I said, adolescents' gender, race, and socioeconomic status independently, and the 2-way interaction, and then the 3-way interaction of all these 3 identities on change in adolescents' dating violence acceptance and gender role beliefs. So we'll explain kind of what that looks like and what that means when we get to the results section. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the sample that this study was conducted on. So if we can go to the next slide. So this sample was obtained from a larger federally funded 5-year intervention project focused on providing individuals with relationship education in order to promote healthy relationships throughout a southeastern state. Adolescent participants were exposed to the Relationship Smarts Plus curriculum, and this consisted of 6 core lessons lasting anywhere from 50 to 90 minutes, and they were taught by community-based educators at the teens' respective high schools. These lessons that were taught contained information and activities focusing on identifying values, building a healthy relationship, healthy ways of breaking up, warning signs of dating abuse, and effective communication skills and smart relationship decision making. So each of the youth included in this study received parental approval via a university IRB approved consent form and completed surveys before and after program participation. but data were also collected from adolescents who did not participate in relationship education. So the use of a comparison or a non-participant sample is beneficial in furthering our understanding of different trajectories of change. But it's important to note that this project was not designed to be an efficacy study, but rather just a demonstration project focused on the feasibility of offering relationship education through community-based partner agencies in diverse communities. So adolescents were not randomly assigned to the participant or comparison group, and there was no specific eligibility for criteria for inclusion in the study. But the final analytic sample consisted of 1,645 adolescents who participated in the Relationship Smarts Plus curriculum and 522 adolescents who did not receive any sort of programming or relationship education. The overall sample was fairly balanced on gender and race, and the average age was just over 15 years old. And mother's education level was used as a proxy for adolescents' socioeconomic status and was diverse. Next slide, please. So I want to talk to y'all about the measures. It may look like a lot of information to some of you, but it's important that we go through this and go over how these items were measured so that you really understand what the teens were responding to and what their responses mean in terms of numbers. So dating violence acceptance was measured using 2 items at both pre and post test, and items include: in today's society, slapping a spouse or a dating partner is understandable under some circumstances, and in today's society, pushing a spouse or a dating partner is understandable under some circumstances. So the adolescents responded using a 5-point scale, ranging from 1 being strongly disagreed to 5 indicating that they strongly agreed to those items. And general beliefs are measured using 3 items at both pre and post test. Items focused on beliefs concerning the roles of males and females with respect to decision-making and authority. So examples include, ultimately, a woman should always submit to a husband's decision, or as head of the household, the father should always have final authority over children. And then a more broad item of men make better leaders than women. So similarly, they responded to a 7-point scale with higher scores indicating more agreement or more traditional gender role beliefs. And then all participant characteristics were dichotomized, as you can see here. So we're just going to jump right into the significant findings of this study. But if you've got any further questions about the measures or the analytic approach, the specific analytic approach, you can find more information in the article, or I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions at the end of this presentation. Okay, next slide. So like I said, first we wanted to look at how program participation impacts adolescents' dating violence acceptance and their gender role beliefs compared to adolescents who did not receive any programming. Next slide. And when looking at change in dating violence acceptance, what we found was that although scores were relatively low overall for acceptance of violence, so just over 1.5 on a scale of 1 to 5, results revealed a statistically significant difference in change patterns in dating violence acceptance between participants and non-participants. So adolescents in the relationship education participant group showed no significant change in dating violence acceptance, meaning their scores were relatively stable over time, whereas the non-participant group indicated a significant increase in dating violence acceptance. So they became more accepting of violence over the 2 time points. And if you look at the points on the left side of the graph, you can see that at pre-test, the scores between the 2 groups were relatively similar, but there's a larger gap between the 2 at post-test. And follow-up analyses revealed that there were no significant differences in those scores at pre-test, but at post-test, the non-participant group was significantly higher. So this seems to suggest that relationship education participation appeared to act as a buffer against a possibly normative increase in adolescents' dating violence acceptance. Next slide. And then when looking at change in gender role beliefs, when comparing the full samples without taking into consideration gender or race or socioeconomic status, the results revealed no significant, statistically significant difference in change patterns in gender role beliefs between participants and non-participants. So that means that the scores in both groups remain relatively stable over time. And additionally, there were no significant differences between groups at pre or post-assessment, so meaning that the scores in both groups were similar to each other across time. However, as I mentioned previously, our goal for this study was not only to look at the change in the average participant over time, but to consider variation in change based on the, oh, we're good, you can go to that next slide. Perfect. Based on the individual and combined influence of adolescents' gender, race, and socioeconomic status. So a series of structural equation models were fit to examine these differences, and these models were fit, so the next few results that you'll see are using only the relationship education participants. So we are not using the comparison sample anymore, or the non-participant sample. And again, for the purpose of this presentation, only the significant findings are being reported, and more information can be found in the attached article. So first, we're going to look at the impact of gender on change in dating violence acceptance. Next slide. So our results suggested that adolescents' gender was related to their change in dating violence acceptance at post-test, and follow-up analyses revealed that there was a significant decrease in dating violence acceptance for females, whereas though small, for males, there's actually a slight significant increase in their dating violence acceptance. So females became less accepting, whereas males became slightly more accepting of violence between the two time points. And these findings are important, and their implications for programming will be discussed in just a few minutes. Next slide. So next, we're going to be discussing our other significant finding, which focused on the combined influence of adolescents' gender and race on their change in gender role beliefs at post-assessment or immediately following the program. Next slide. So results indicated that the interaction of gender and race was significantly associated with adolescents' change in gender role beliefs at post-assessment. And follow-up analyses revealed that Black males showed a significant and steeper decrease in their endorsement of traditional gender role beliefs, meaning they became less traditional and more egalitarian following program participation, whereas Black females, however, became slightly more traditional following programming. And alternatively, white male and female participants' scores on this measure stayed relatively stable, meaning they did not become significantly more or less traditional after program participation. Next slide. So let's just do a quick review / summary of the findings and discuss why myself and my co-authors believe we found the results that we did. So although reducing the acceptance of and use of aggression in relationships is often an explicitly targeted outcome of relationship education programs, very few studies have examined change in dating violence acceptance after program participation. And those that do find less dating violence acceptance. And we expected a similar result. However, the participant group did not show a reduction in dating violence acceptance, but rather in this sample, there was a small but significant shift towards more acceptance of dating violence that occurred for the non-participants, while the participant group remained on average lower. So while we emphasize that levels of acceptance for both groups are in the lower portion of the response range at both pre and post test, again, this finding suggests that relationship education may actually protect adolescents against a normative increase in dating violence acceptance. And this slight increase in acceptance of dating violence among the non-participant group is challenging to explain, and we can really only speculate as to why this occurred. So as previous research suggests, adolescents may sometimes mistake physical aggression as a form of conflict resolution or assertiveness as an expression of caring, which may explain why we might see a pattern of increasing acceptance of aggression during adolescence among the non-participant sample. However, the environment of relationship education provides a context within which adolescents can clarify their beliefs about the acceptability of violence and aggression, and thus the experience itself may act as a protective factor against an increase in dating violence acceptance and possibly later dating violence perpetration and victimization. But importantly, our examination of moderators of change in the participant group reveals a more complex story than is first evident from the group comparisons. So though the average participant seemed to maintain a low level of acceptance of dating violence over time, once subgroups were considered, we actually found that female participants became less accepting of dating violence, whereas male participants became slightly more accepting, which was more similar to those in the non-participant group. So this is the first study to evaluate the moderating effect of gender on change in dating violence acceptance following relationship education. And our findings offer some initial indication that females may be more receptive to messages in relationship education regarding the acceptability of dating violence. So it's possible that, as suggested by both the theory of gender and power and the gender intensification hypothesis, this identification with social norms surrounding the expectations of male power and authority and the general acceptability of male perpetrated aggression may be so heightened during adolescence, particularly for males, which may explain why we didn't see improvement in that group like we did with the females. But further studies are really needed to investigate whether males are more resistant to these messages and whether they may benefit from enhanced discussion and program content on healthy and unhealthy dating patterns. But what's also noteworthy is that there were no differences in change patterns by race or socioeconomic status. But on average, it was evident that Black and lower SES participants in youth relationship education were more accepting of violence at both time points. And these findings align with the previous research that minority and lower SES adolescents tend to be more accepting of violence than non-minority and higher SES peers. But again, their scores were relatively low overall within the given range of responses. But their stabilization across both time points offers implications for future program developers and educators that we'll discuss towards the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. And there is some previous evidence to suggest that although gender role beliefs are not a specific target outcome of relationship education, other areas in the program content, so for example, those that emphasize the importance of a respectful as well as an equal and supportive relationship, possibly foster a shift in participants' perspectives regarding roles and expectations in relationships. And in this study, it initially appeared that there was no change in gender role beliefs for the participant group or the non-participant group. And though one previous study found a small but significant shift towards more egalitarian gender role beliefs among youth participants, it may be more challenging to replicate this, given that the adherence to and the salience of gender-related norms is often exacerbated during adolescence. And our sample was slightly more egalitarian at pre-test than the previous study, so they had less room for change or improvements in this outcome. And again, importantly, we sought to emphasize less the experience of the average participant and extend to explore differences that may exist between subgroups of the relationship education participant sample. So these findings revealed that at the start of the program, Black males were more traditional than any other gender by race subgroup. And because the measure of gender role beliefs in this study emphasized male dominance and authority, particularly within the home, this finding aligns with Hill's suggestion that Black males may be more likely to define masculinity in terms of power and dominance in romantic relationships and family life, and as such may hold more traditional gender role beliefs than others in this context. But because traditional gender role beliefs are often associated with dating violence, perpetration, and victimization, one may assume that this would make Black males at greater risk for engaging in dating violence. But in our study, this subgroup showed the greatest decrease in traditional gender role beliefs following program participation, indicating that the greatest improvements were found for those individuals who could arguably be considered the most at risk for dating violence experiences. And this shift towards more egalitarian beliefs likely has important implications. So like I said, it's possible that by altering these traditional gender role beliefs, we may ultimately lessen the risk of adolescent dating violence, particularly within this subgroup of adolescents. But in contrast to Black males, in the current study, Black females, although still low, became slightly more traditional over the two time points. And Hill also suggests that although children in African American families may be taught gender equality, this may not extend to romantic relationships and household expectations. So although in this study, Black males became more egalitarian after program participation, there may just not be enough discussion surrounding gender role beliefs to prevent this shift towards more traditional norms reported by the Black females in this sample. But despite our expectations, the three-way interaction of gender, race, and socioeconomic status were not related to change in either of the two outcomes. Next slide, please. So although the study broaches an area of new terrain in the relationship education literature, there are still limitations that should be addressed. So first, even though this study utilized a comparison or a non-participant sample, it's important to note that because this was a demonstration project, the individuals were not randomly assigned to a participant or a comparison group. And the use of randomization would strengthen the assurance that changes in dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs are due to program participation. And although the study used pre and immediate post-assessment approach, using additional longer-term longitudinal designs, so multiple time points, would help to better understand and potentially identify long-lasting or delayed improvements even that are resulting from relationship education. And it's also important to note the highly influential nature of peers during adolescence. So as such, the self-report measures may be influenced by the adolescents' perceptions of what their peer group considered to be socially acceptable and appropriate, and then in turn may affect how honestly they responded to the items on the survey. And because physical violence has a stigma attached to it, individuals may be less likely to disclose their true feelings. And the relatively low averages of dating violence acceptance and traditional gender role beliefs at both time points suggest that the adolescents in this sample were relatively low in their acceptance of violence and generally held more egalitarian beliefs across both time points. And it's possible that more variation in acceptance and gender role beliefs would be captured if measures including the acceptance of other forms of aggression beyond physical violence were also considered, or a more comprehensive measure of gender role beliefs tapping into the various domains of gender roles. And one strength of this study includes the examination of the potential moderating effect of maternal education level on change. But the lack of study findings specific to education level may be attributed to the limited measurement of socioeconomic status. So although other studies consider this as an acceptable proxy for socioeconomic status, we may benefit, or future studies may benefit, from a more comprehensive measure of socioeconomic status. So including employment status and whether the child is qualified for free or reduced lunch may also be considered. And then like I said, the three-way interaction of gender, race, and SES was not related to the amount of change in gender role beliefs or dating violence acceptance. And to date, the majority of the literature on intersectionality has been situated within adult samples. So as such, more research examining intersectionality and its meaning for adolescents is still warranted. And because responses to both gender role beliefs and dating violence acceptance might be influenced by perceptions of socially desirable and acceptable responses, accounting for class level factors may help to enhance the understanding of how to more adequately address certain beliefs or uniquely tailor interventions. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. And again, more research accounting for demographic characteristics of facilitators, so gender, race, and age of facilitators or educators, may offer valuable information on improving participant facilitator match and in turn possibly enhance effectiveness of the programs. And lastly, future research using a randomized control design will provide a more definitive test of program impact, and the use of longer-term longitudinal designs will help to determine whether or not the positive effects that we found in this study continue beyond immediate post-assessment, and again, to potentially identify any delayed effects for subgroups as a result of programming. Next slide. So what does this all mean for educators and program developers? So what can we take from this to make our students' classroom experiences even better than before? First is that educators or facilitators may also consider incorporating messages regarding the use of unhealthy relationship behaviors, particularly dating violence, throughout multiple lessons. So although in the Relationship Smarts Plus curriculum, there is one lesson solely focusing on dating violence, this message about the unacceptability of violence in romantic relationships can be incorporated throughout the entire program. And by incorporating these messages throughout the entire program, in addition to the existing unit on dating violence, it may help to evoke similar shifts towards less acceptance of dating violence for all participants in the classes. And as I mentioned in the limitations section, peers are highly influential during this time. So that being said, similar to the previous idea is the suggestion that educators and facilitators may consider assessing or evaluating the group's needs or the class climate, meaning the students' thoughts and ideas about violence acceptance and traditional gender roles prior to program implementation. And in doing so, you may be better prepared to address the students' misconceptions and attitudes early on and repeatedly throughout the program, which may also help to elicit a more desirable shift for all program participants. Additionally, in this study, reductions in dating violence acceptance were documented for female participants. And this is an important outcome goal, so it's somewhat concerning that reductions weren't evidenced for all participants, but it's important to note that the facilitators of these programs were predominantly female. So some studies in the adult literature suggest the benefits of therapist-client match or similarities. More specifically, they argue that individuals experience greater benefits from therapy when they are able to identify with their therapist. So there's no real evidence of this in the context of youth relationship education, but there is some initial evidence supporting the benefits of participant-facilitator match in the adult relationship education literature. So under this same idea, it may be helpful to involve more diversity amongst facilitator, both gender and race, as well as implementing co-facilitation teams when possible. And although gender role beliefs are not a specific target outcome of relationship education programs, given their linkage to dating violence experiences, program developers and educators may consider modifying current programs to incorporate a unit on gender role beliefs, particularly those related to male privilege and authority, and provide greater discussion surrounding the topic. Because adolescence is a time in which these divergent expectations of roles are heavily reinforced, the incorporation of a unit on gender role beliefs may elicit a shift towards more egalitarian gender role beliefs in all subgroups of participants. And the theory of gender and power suggests that in many instances, individuals in society may knowingly or unknowingly reinforce differing traditional roles for males and females. So as such, prior to implementing programs in which gender role beliefs are discussed, educators may benefit from critical self-reflection regarding their own stance on gender roles. And this is a process that's often used in qualitative research. So in qualitative research, engagement and critical self-reflection serves to improve an individual's objectivity and decrease the likelihood that their personal biases influence their interpretation of the findings. So the use of critical self-reflection in relationship education curriculum trainings through the use of tactics such as journaling may increase educators' awareness of the subtle ways in which they may unintentionally deliver gendered messages when delivering programming. But these are just some of the ways in which this study can and does serve to inform both programmatic development and implementation. But importantly, this study is a step forward in inclusivity by exploring the impact that sociodemographic identities have on individuals' beliefs and attitudes in the context of youth relationship education. And this is particularly valuable for educators and program developers seeking to understand for whom their programs are most effective. Next slide, please. So before we move on to questions, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge my previous advisors and the co-authors of this study, Dr. Francesca Adler-Bader, who is at Auburn University, and Dr. Megan Hazelshort, who is at UT Knoxville. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Adler-Bader's project, the Alabama Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education Initiative, from which this study was conducted. And again, I've included a link or a reference to the article in case any of you may want to look this up later or just kind of do a little bit more of a deep dive into this study. And the next 3 slides are just a list of the references that I had mentioned as we were going through. So again, those are available for you to kind of follow up on those studies if you'd like. But that's it for my presentation part of this. So thank you all so much for listening.
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. And I do have, as you were talking, some comments that were presented to us.
Oh, awesome.
And One of them was a question from Anna Morrison, who wondered, she thought she would add culture to the poll on the 3 identities of intersectionality. Do you have any comment about where culture fits into this, or why it wasn't included specifically?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there is so much more to intersectionality to than just gender, race, and socioeconomic status. There's also religion and like I said, a host of other things. It can get really, really complex when we start to consider more of these. So this is just one of the first studies to start to, like I said, look at the intersection of multiple identities. So that's why culture wasn't included. But I definitely think that moving forward, again, there needs to be more research taking an intersectional approach, and we need to broaden it even beyond just gender, race, and socioeconomic status to also include things such as culture and, like I said, religion and abilities and other things. So that's a great point, and I appreciate your comment.
Okay, thank you. And that brings us also to the other comment where one person asked, do you think one's religion would have an effect on the results as well?
Yes, so that is an excellent question and something that we had discussed. We didn't have a measure exactly of that for this study, but I did do a kind of a deep dive in the literature on that. And it becomes so complex when you look at religion because it's, more than just a title. So there's so much variation within that makes it a really complex web to measure. But there is some research out there looking at gender role beliefs and in the context of religion, and again, how complex it really is.
Mm-hmm. And I think the part of it of being relationship education is relatively new in any studies with youth. And it's only been, I would say, the last 10 years that this has really caught on. And as the years continue, we seem to be getting a little bit more awareness of the importance of youth relationships on their futures.
Definitely. And like we said, just with culture and religion, there are so many factors that play into the effectiveness of a program or an individual's responsiveness to a program and the information in a program. So definitely much more to consider and test.
Well, Lisa is asking, have you done any work with attachment insecurity, anxious styles, and DVA?
I have not. That is actually something that was more recently added to that project before I left. Attachment styles aren't necessarily kind of like my research area. So I have not done anything on that, but I think that would really be interesting because we know that early life experiences have such an impact on later relationship experiences as well. So like my focus, I've also looked at the impact of exposure to violence in the home and child abuse and maltreatment on adolescents, dating relationships. So I can only imagine how attachment and may play into that as well. But no, I have not.
And that seems like a relatively new look at that as well, especially now that we're looking more into the impact of trauma on children in later years. It's amazing. Elizabeth and Lisa must be in the same room because Elizabeth says, how does exposure to domestic violence, interparental violence, impact DVA or GRB?
Oh, I have got a wonderful study coming out soon for you, actually, because that is a study that I recently conducted. There's some literature on that. And again, it's crazy how complex it is. So there is evidence to suggest that exposure to interparental violence within the home and different types of violence has different effects. So if you're looking at psychological abuse between parents and how that plays a different role in influencing, like I said, these gender role beliefs and dating violence acceptance. So there is evidence it's coming out. I don't want to spoil the surprise for you, but
Mhm.
give me your email address, and when my study gets published, I will send it your way so you can see all the juicy new information out there.
Oh,
But
great. Well,
there's no studies to date that have looked at that, actually.
Mhm.
So that will be one of the first.
Well, we will have everyone's email address. So if anybody else wants that study, we can send that to them, and they can just let us know with an email that they're interested.
Yeah.
That email would go to rachel@dibbleinstitute.org.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to share that with everyone once it's out there.
Bill Coffin of Healthy Marriage Education, who's so famous for that, says it was a wonderful presentation. So,
Thanks,
fun
Bill.
to hear from Bill. And is there a curriculum program that you would recommend or found particularly effective in changing DV beliefs and behaviors? This is from Kalia Murray.
So, yes, Relationship Smarts actually is very effective, and there's a lot of evidence and finding support for its effectiveness on dating violence experiences and adolescents dating violence acceptance. So what's important to note in this study is, like I said, we used a 2-item measure. So if we were able to utilize something that was a little bit more complex or tapped into acceptability of other forms of violence, we may have seen greater variation in it. But adolescents were overall pretty, reluctant to saying that violence was acceptable under circumstances, despite circumstances in this study. So that's likely why we didn't see necessarily as much of a shift as other studies have seen. But I love Relationship Smarts Plus. There's a new version out, and the kids really love it. And I can tell you just from my experience in teaching it that I have had them in their say, like I said, I didn't realize that wasn't okay. So even if it's not showing up in that data, I know from my personal experiences with them that there has been a shift in their perceptions for those who are accepting or who thought that this was okay.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and
or life notes.
Yeah, and I could add that on our website, under the toolbar, top toolbar on our homepage, why it matters, there are evaluations, and also those evaluations can be found on each program that we publish on each of their individual pages on our website. So there's plenty of other types of studies that have taken place specific to each of our programs that you might find interesting as helpful in making a decision on a curriculum that you can implement in your organization. Well, we've come to the time. I don't have any more questions or comments here, and I am we're coming to the end. And Erin, if you could bring up the ending slides for us. Thank you again for joining us today. Erin, do you have next month's webinar listing? Our webinar will be self-regulation skills to support healthy relationship for youth with Dr. Desiree Murray, who is a senior research scientist, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And if you could go back one, Erin, thank you. I'd appreciate it. What we ask that you keep in touch. If you are not on our email email newsletter, you can sign up at relationshipskills@dibbleinstitute.org or www.dibbleinstitute.org. And we're on Facebook. Our number is 800-695-7975. And we are very, very welcoming to questions, comments, and also we have digital review copies free for 30 days for you to look at any particular program. Maybe Relationship Smarts Plus. You want to know more about it. You want to see what's involved in it, how it relates to what Rachel has talked about today. Please give us an email or a phone call, and we'll be happy to send that to you. We look forward to hearing from you again in future webinars. Take care and be safe. Thank you.